writers and readers, I'm Christy Stratus, and today I wanted to talk to you about showing instead of telling. Now this is a very, very common subject that a lot of writers and editors talk about, but I have to say that even though I had read lots of blog posts and things like that about it, when I was younger I never understood it, and it took me a lot of time and a lot of studying of really excellent books to get what it actually means. One of the misconceptions about showing instead of telling is to think that it just means add more colors, add more descriptions of rooms, add more descriptions of peoples, things like that that rely on description. It's not so much about including description and color as adding relevance to those things. So today I'm going to try to explain that in a way that makes more sense and in the way that I would like to have heard before I went on my own writing journey. First of all, the idea of adding colors and of adding more depth to scenery and things like that, those are all positive things, but they're not necessarily showing instead of telling. There was a book that I wrote in high school that I really didn't understand this whole concept of showing instead of telling, and so I would also just add colors and things like that. But what I didn't realize was that a lot of the things I was adding really didn't matter anyway. So while it can be good to explain what a room looks like so that you have an idea of what your character is seeing, at the same time, why do we need to know? If there isn't a reason that the reader needs to know what the room looks like, then there may be no relevance in showing it. So one of the things to consider is, what am I doing? What is my purpose behind this? Is it just to add some extra text? Just to add some extra depth? You know, if your answer is extra depth, then you're on the right track. But the question then becomes, what am I really showing? Am I just showing that it's a house with a dining room? If you go and you describe a dining room, you say, your character walks into a dining room, there was a wooden table and it seated this many people and the chairs were hard-backed and the walls were this color and there was a chandelier. Why? That sounds like a kind of a silly question, but actually it is never silly to ask why. Instead, maybe consider showing the room as the character is walking through it. So instead of the character walking into the room and just describing it sort of flatly, that's what I would consider flatly. I've heard other authors describe that as flatly as well. You might want to consider having your character walk through and just sitting down on a hardback chair that makes her back ache. So that way, when you say it's a hardback chair, there is relevance to the character. There's a reason that we're saying this. We're not just saying it's a hardback chair. We're saying that it hurts her back, right? So that actually gives you something more about the character. It gives you something more about the room. If you say something about the color of the sofa, let's go back to my famous blue sofa. There was a time when I mentioned a blue sofa and like, why do we care that it's blue? That is something that is showing instead of telling. Okay, it's a blue sofa. Tell me more about how the sofa is blue. Tell me more about how the walls are white. It does not matter to me as a reader. It's not going to make a difference to my perception of the book or the characters unless there is relevance to the reason why the couch is blue. Does it represent something more? Are you representing the character's melancholy through the fact that the sofa is an unusual shade of blue? Or maybe you have the sofa's blue fade over time to show the passage of time, to show maybe her lack of interest in being an interior designer anymore, maybe something along those lines. If there's a reason that the sofa is a color, if there is a reason that the sofa is faded, if there are reasons behind these things, then we as readers are being shown instead of told. But again, if you just tell me a sofa is blue, it goes right out of my mind as a reader and I don't care. Now I'm certainly not trying to be harsh, and there are definitely times when it can help to describe a room, but again, describe it as the character is going through it. Don't describe it as something flat. A really good example of this is We Need to Talk About Kevin. There is a part where, first of all, Eva and Franklin, the two main characters, I won't describe the whole book to you, of course, but these two characters end up moving to the suburbs, and they move into this very cold sort of house. There are very few doors, it's very open, but at the same time there isn't much character or personality to it. And the funny thing about it is that Eva, who's the colder of the two people in the relationship, Eva doesn't like it at all, and what she describes that she would have liked is like a Victorian house or something like that with historical relevance. And the interesting thing about that is, like I said, Eva's the colder character. You would think that she would like a modern, colder house. Instead, she wants something that has a lot of history behind it. But this actually relates back to her character. Earlier in the book, she mentions that one of the reasons she accepts the idea of having a child even though she doesn't want one is because it could add context to her story. That's a cold reason to have a child, obviously, if you're just saying, well, you know, I'm running out of things to talk about. Are we really going to talk about the same things all our lives? Is there anything new for me to do? Well, maybe I'll have a kid, I guess. You know, that's only part of it. There is more to it than that. But if you think about that, the fact that she's saying she wants to add more story to her life, then yes, her wanting a Victorian house that already has a story behind it that she can share with other people and appreciate herself makes a lot of sense. Franklin is the much, much warmer of the two, but he's the one who decides to buy this cold house. Well, it has no history to it. He's looking for a fresh start. He's thinking that if they move to that house, things will change, things will be different. They'll be around the people that they need to be around, more mothers and fathers and people who might influence Eva in a good, positive way. And so for him, wiping the slate clean is what he's looking for. So even though the house seems to be a reverse of each of their opinions or what they would each want, it actually does say something about who they are as people and their intentions. So you're actually accomplishing a lot there just by talking about your feelings about a house. So that's another example of showing instead of telling. We can get a lot from their characters just from that. One of the other ways to think of showing and telling and the difference between them, because sometimes people get a little bit confused, like, okay, wait, what is the difference? How can I tell if I'm showing or telling? Think of it this way. Maybe this will help. Telling is when it could sound like the author is the one who's saying this. Okay, so if you have narration that sounds more like the author trying to get a point across, that's telling, for sure. That's a dead giveaway. Character walks into a room, and again, I'm going back to this example. Character walks into the room is described, but there's not really a reason behind it. The author is trying to just tell you about the room just by adding some amount of description or whatever. It doesn't do anything for the character. It doesn't sound like it's from the character's perspective. There doesn't seem to be a real purpose to the book. So obviously it was the author who wanted it there. That's how you can tell if you're telling instead of showing. It's just one way. But I think that helps a lot. When I proofread and edit my books, and of course, like with each book we write, we try to move forward, we improve. When I'm editing Lock and Key, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, does this sound like something a character could really find relevant? Does this sound like something a character would think about? Or does it sound like something that I wanted to put there or I needed to accomplish? Especially you can find this in characters' logic. If you find that a character's logic seems to just jump, or there's a gap somewhere in their logic, there's a gap in what they're talking about, all of a sudden we're on that subject, wait, how did we get there? Maybe there is no consistency to the subject matter. That is an author trying to accomplish something. And what you do is, okay, that's first draft, second draft material, whatever. You're going through that, you realize this, you have to look at it. Maybe this is where taking a break for like a month or even 2 weeks from your manuscript can really, really help. You try to take that step back, look at it as a reader and say, does it make sense for the character to say this? Is this the way the character would speak? Is this the actual flow of conversation the character would really have? Or is it really just, I am doing this as an author because it needs to be done? That can easily be fixed. That doesn't mean you run yourself into a corner. It's not uncommon and it's not something to be worried about. It's really just something to recognize and then say, okay, let me think about my character. What would this character really say? What would they really do? Let me go inside my mind and my imagination and really get into character and think about that. And a lot of times you're going to come out with something that flows a lot better for the book, that sounds much more in character, and that accomplishes something much more artistic and much more that feels creative than what you currently have. This is one of the things that I really want to accomplish actually in my future as a writer. One of the great dreams that I have is writing a book like We Need to Talk About Kevin, that really speak from the character's perspective so deeply that the author doesn't even have a voice. It's really just the character speaking the whole time. There's no narration that's in a different voice, nothing like that. It's just the character all the way through, and that's one of the brilliant things about that book. That's something in the book Room. There are a number of books that this happens, and it is absolutely brilliant. So definitely read books like those if you want to get an idea of what I mean by showing instead of telling, but also what I mean by actually telling the story as the character as opposed to in author narration. Another thing is, of course, the classic idea of explaining everything in an information dump. If you realize you've done an info dump, you see just like a big info dump there where you needed to get a point across and there was just no better way than to just put a whole big paragraph of explanation. That's something to think about. You need to break that up. You need to have it in conversation. You have it come up naturally. You need to put some creativity into that and think, all right, how can I make this less just here's the information I need to get across, and more in character, part of the ambiance of the book, part of the book itself, instead of just this is what the author needed to say. That is a big mistake that a lot of authors make and a lot of reviewers complain about. So keep your eyes open for that as well. That is definitely telling instead of showing. Another way to show instead of tell is to make sure that the book is absolutely saturated with ambiance and with relevance, symbolic relevance, that everything the characters do is necessary, that everything contributes to the point of the book, the ambiance of the book, the plot, the characters' psychologies, just absolutely saturate the dialogue, their movements, just everything they do, and that will really make a huge difference in your book. That's something I worked really hard on in Lock and Key, and you'll notice that in Lock and Key, every hand movement really means something, and I focused a lot on that because that is something that Mr. Locke does all the time, and it's on purpose. Paying close attention to the way he composes himself is extremely important. If you are interested in looking deeper into the book, every time he does something with his hands, anytime he withdraws or puts himself into somebody's space, every time he gets closer, everything means something with him, and there is so much relevance to that, to his character, to figuring him out, to understanding him. And that's something I try to do with all my characters, and I try to do it more and more and more. So down below I'm going to link a blog post that I wrote, and I came up with just something random. This is not from a book I wrote, this is not from a piece I wrote. Just something random to sort of show you in writing what showing instead of telling can look like. And what I did was write something purposefully, instead of saying, you know, this woman frowned, I chose to instead go into some detail about this. And it seems like a simple thing, but actually when you read it, you'll see that a lot is accomplished in this description of her frowning. And so what I do is give you the quote, and then underneath I tell you all that you can actually learn from the way that I phrase it. So that's a really good example of showing instead of telling. The way that you can think of this is that the point is that the reader can learn and understand more instead of being told more. And that's one of the things that you're going to find in really excellent books that you get absorbed in. In Harry Potter, you're going to see that all over the place. You're not being told everything, you're being shown it. You know, J.K. Rowling is painting an actual picture for you, and it's a beautiful thing, and you really get into it. You feel like you're in that world, and that's the reason. So one of the things you can do is choose a book that you really love, like Harry Potter, like We Need to Talk About Kevin, Room, a Brandon Sanderson, Stormlight Archives book, something like that. And as you go through it, really pay attention and deconstruct what they're doing when they describe something. When the author describes something, when the author puts movements in there, yes, there are sometimes throwaway movements like, you know, somebody blinking a lot to show that they're confused. There are some common things like licking lips, like biting lips, worrying, like, you know, doing some fidgeting with their hands, stuff like that. All of that you can totally use. I mean, it doesn't have to be a totally original way of phrasing something, this showing rather than telling, but it does have to do with what's going on. So if you have a nervous character, then give them nervous motions so that it all contributes. You know, maybe somebody's turning the ring on their finger around a lot. Clearly they are nervous, they're just sitting there fidgeting, stuff like that. I have that in one of my characters in Lock and Key, not that exact movement, but to show that he constantly fidgets and that there's a reason to it. I have him doing different things throughout the book. I have some similar things. There's a reason those are threaded throughout. It all contributes to his personality and the issues he has. So when you go back through your book and you're editing, and you find things like licking lips over and over, like biting lips, this is a common thing that authors do. Again, this is not something where you should look at it and be like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. This is just something that every author does. You write the book, you have repetitive things. when you find these descriptions, see if there's any way that you can make these descriptions relevant to what's going on. Make it so that the character is expressing themselves through whatever movement they're making, twirling their hair or whatever, you know? So everything in there is relevant. That is something that makes a fantastic book that is extremely absorbing, and where the characters not just stand out, but they are 3D. You know, they're not just memorable, they're real. And one more way that I'm going to suggest that you can show instead of tell is to personalize every sentence for your book. That sounds really tedious, but I promise that once you get into it, it is so worth it, and it becomes very absorbing. You get like really, really into it. If you look at a sentence and you're not thrilled with it, one of the ways that you can analyze it is to say, well, of course, you know, I'm talking about a sentence that is well written and you've already edited it down, but you're looking at it and you're sort of like, this is kind of plain. Think to yourself, how can I personalize it so that if this sentence was presented outside of my book, it would still sound like it's from my book? That kind of writing, that's tough to do with every single sentence, but that's one way. If you find a sentence that you feel is plain or generic, that you can say, how can I personalize this so that it sounds like I wrote it? And you know what? It's totally okay if you look at that and you say, I don't know how to make this sentence sound like I wrote it. What do I sound like? I do that all the time. And so I just go back and read some of the other stuff that I've written, you know, just past pages, or maybe there's a particular section that you really like because it's very showing instead of telling, or it's extremely in character. Go back and read it. Analyze what you've done as well. Analyze your own writing. I mean, it's extremely useful. And then you will much easier be able to infuse sentences with your own style, even when you're not even sure how to do it. That's one way. And maybe I'll do another video on how to analyze style, how to analyze books to understand when you see something you love, how to get the most out of that book. Whether you're reading it the first time, second time, third time, whatever, there are ways, there are actual strategies you can use to pick it apart, not to ruin it, but to appreciate it and to learn something from it. This is something I have done so many times. I do it in pretty much every book I read now. You don't need to do that, but it is extremely helpful. So maybe I'll do a video on that. I think it could help you also figure out how to show instead of tell. It can help you how to put things in character instead of your own author voice or your personal narration, things like that. Maybe I'll do a video on that. So I really hope that this helped. If you have further questions, definitely leave them down below. I will be happy to answer them. If you have ideas, something you'd like to see in a video, always let me know. I'm always open to suggestions. And as always, thank you so much for spending time with me.